Welcome back to another episode of The Lawyer You Know. My name is Peter Tragos. I'm a personal injury and criminal defense lawyer in the Tampa Bay area in Florida. And on this channel, we like to give you an insight into the minds of trial lawyers and judges and clients and witnesses and everything that happens inside the courtroom. And we do that by breaking down trials in whole or parts of trials so you can know what the lawyers are thinking, what the purpose of their questions are, and what their strategy might be. And we love to hear from you in the comments because you are potential jurors in whatever jurisdiction you live. So you can let us know whether potential jurors and lay people see things differently than lawyers. And that's what's so fun and important about this channel. We also make a lot of videos to let you know what your rights are so that you can know the consequences of your decisions potentially, or what your rights are for protections against the powers that be, whether it be law enforcement, the government, or just other citizens that live around you. It's a really fun channel. The comments are one of the most fun part of it. So make sure you get in the comments because we respond to as many as we can. And every week we do a live so you can ask questions and get answers from me on our channel. So make sure you catch that by hitting the reminder bell and you'll get alerted whenever we do it. We try to do it most Fridays, but sometimes we've got to audible due to my work schedule because I am not a full-time YouTuber. I am a full-time practicing lawyer. So let's get into the topic for today, which is the movie theater shooting right here in our backyard in Pasco County, where a former law enforcement officer by the name of Curtis Reeves shot Mr. Olsen, the alleged victim, in the movie theater, potentially over some popcorn, but maybe not. That was the narrative. Maybe it's changing. Some people feel like it is. And we're going to break down today his wife's testimony. She took the stand in order to help her husband's defense. And she said a lot of important things in this portion of her testimony we're going to react to and talk about today. Some were very helpful to her husband's defense, but others may have hurt it. So let's jump into a part of the testimony. We didn't break down the beginning where she talked about how old he is and the ailments he has. Most of the testimony over this trial has been kind of boring when talking about, the video and the pixels and, how when you age, things get harder and you move slower and you're more susceptible, which is things we already know. So we're not going to break down a lot of that, but we are going to talk about her explanation of the facts of what happened surrounding that shooting. So let's jump into the video now and we'll talk about what this part of the trial is always like for trial lawyers.
And once that happens, tell me, is there any sort of conversation or any kind of communication between your husband and Mr. Olsen?
Yes, Curtis leaned forward toward Mr. Olsen and he spoke so softly. I don't know. I thought that I heard the word phone, but I cannot be sure.
All right. So just off the jump, we see how she's going to use words and say things that obviously help her husband. The prosecution's going to argue she's biased. Obviously, the jury's going to know she's biased towards her husband, but that doesn't make what she's saying not true. But she is trying to lessen the blow, saying he was speaking so softly I could barely hear him, but I heard him say the word phone. Whether or not you believe that, I don't think is as important as a lot of what she's going to get to.
When you say, did you hear really either one of them talk except for maybe the word phone?
Yes, sir.
Okay, you didn't hear either one of them? In other words,
no.
You didn't hear your husband. Did you hear your husband?
I know. I couldn't hear him.
A little clunky there by the lawyer. And I'll tell you, when you're a lawyer and you're directing either the client or a family member of the client, sometimes you've practiced it so many times and it's not coaching a witness to practice it, okay? She's dealing with a very traumatic event. It helps nerves. Normal people don't like to take the stand and testify in front of a jury, let alone having cameras and thousands of people watching, okay? So let's have a little grace there, number one. Number two, practicing it just gets them more comfortable with the cadence, what it's going to be like in the courtroom, take away some of their anxiety. But sometimes when you practice a lot, it can look like this, where the lawyer's expecting one answer and she's answering a different question later on, and you'll hear kind of back and forth with him. He'll say, the lawyer will say, we'll get to that, meaning she jumped the gun a little bit, no pun intended. So we'll just keep that in mind as it feels a little clunky at times. They have probably practiced this before and the lawyer wants to get specific facts out, but Mrs. Reeves also wants to make sure she's getting the correct facts out to help her husband and answer the questions honestly because she swore under oath she's telling the truth.
Maybe I heard the word phone, but I'm not certain.
All right. And so they were both speaking in lower tones. Is that fair to say?
No.
Okay. Tell me what you mean by that.
Mr. Olsen very loudly said,
Well, we're gonna get there. So first what happens
Okay.
is,
See, I mean, that's just prophetic almost, where she's like, no, Mr. Olsen spoke very loudly. She wants to make sure she gets that out. Sometimes the witnesses go rogue and the trial lawyers just got to adapt. Now, I don't usually interrupt them and stop them and go back. I let her say it. If she's going to say something good for my client, which she's going to, that he screamed some F word, I'm just going to let her say it and then I'll work it into the direct. He decides to kind of stop her and back up before she gets to the punchline, which I don't love that kind of form, but he's trying to make sure he goes systematically through it and hits everything he needs to hit, because sometimes when the witness goes rogue, you miss an important fact that you want them to get out during direct examination.
Curtis leans forward and you hear some soft conversation.
yes,
You don't know who spoke first, do you?
Curtis did.
And then you hear something, the word phone.
And he's asking leading questions. Sorry, I keep interrupting you. This is just kind of some nuance here. You don't know who talked first, do you? That's an indication to her to say no, but she says yes, Curtis did. So I don't think the lawyer's expecting some of these answers.
That's what you described,
Yes.
something like that. Okay. And then after that, what happens?
Mr. Olsen responded in a very loud and ugly voice.
Okay, now, you don't have to say the word, but describe what he said. What, did he use the F word?
Yes, he did.
What do you remember him saying?
He used the F word, and he's texting his daughter.
Important fact, that's in line with what the defense is saying. Mr. Olsen was the one that escalated it, using curse words, screaming, speaking loudly, when Mr. Reeves was being polite and soft-spoken, according to his wife at least. This is going along with their narrative. It is helpful. Somebody else that was there, right there, that could hear and see everything that was going on.
Hey, do you know that he said texting, or do you just remember that he said the word daughter?
I'm not certain.
And that, just as a little procedural thing, she's already testified in the stand your ground hearing, so there is prior testimony. The lawyers are trying to protect her from getting impeached. I'm going to bet that in a prior statement, she said she's not sure who spoke first, she's not sure if it was texting or calling, she just knows it was the word daughter. He is trying to protect her from getting impeached by the prosecution, where she's saying, the prosecutor comes up and says, so now you know they were texting, but before you weren't sure if it was call or text. You just knew he was talking to his daughter, right? You're changing your statement. So that's why there's some of this clunky testimony on direct. He's trying to protect her from getting impeached on cross.
Now, at that point, were the previews on?
Yes.
And were you able to hear Mr. Olsen's voice over the previews?
Oh, yes.
Were the previews, was Mr. Olsen's voice then louder than the previews?
It was loud. It was louder than the previews.
If you've been watching the trial, you know that's been a thing. Whether the previews were on, whether they were loud or not, how loud Mr. Olsen is, how you could possibly hear him if the previews were on. So that's just kind of more trying to build more consistent narrative.
Now, was it possible that the trailers were playing? In other
Yeah.
words, okay,
Yes.
that's the same as previews to you.
Previews.
Now, let me ask you this. When you heard that response from Mr. Olsen, how did it make you feel?
It scared me. I've never.
Objection, relevance.
Sustained.
Okay.
All right, very important part. What happened when you heard that from Mr. Olsen? It scared me. Objection, relevance, and it's sustained. I disagree with the judge sustaining that, because I think this is relevant. And the point is, the jury heard it. So let's talk about what this means. She is a person of older age. I don't know how old she is, but somewhere similar to Curtis Reeves' age. And she's saying the way that Mr. Olsen was acting was scaring her. So when we're trying to determine as a jury, and you guys let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with her, she is giving us another instance as to whether or not it was reasonable to be in fear based on how Mr. Olsen was acting at the movie theater. So we know that Curtis Reeves is going to say he was in fear, and Mrs. Reeves now says she's in fear. So the two people that were right there where this was directed at them, they were both afraid. And that's very important for this self-defense defense that Mr. Reeves' team is putting on.
So let's take out that it scared you. You heard that.
Let's take out that it scared you, but he gets to mention it again.
Those words.
Take out those words, he tells her. Again, this is just an indication they practiced. Take out those words, but still give me the answer. It's funny. It's just interesting to see like how lawyers work.
And tell me then, what happened next?
I don't know what period of time, short time. Curtis handed me his he stood up, he handed me his popcorn and stood up and said, "I'm going to get the manager."
All right. Now, when you saw your husband stand up and go to get the manager, at that point, had Mr. Olsen turned around at all, or you're just hearing him?
I'm just hearing him.
Now, your husband gets up, tells you he's going to get the manager. Do you say anything to your husband?
I said, "Let's just move."
Do you know if your husband heard you or not?
I don't.
Did he respond to you at all?
No.
Did he say, "We're not going to move"?
No.
Okay, so to me, may not have seemed super important, but this is some of the most damning testimony. The prosecutor is going to argue they should have just moved. A lot of you in the comments have argued they should have just moved. I would have just moved, is what a lot of you have said. Because when you get in this kind of awkward verbal altercation with another grown man, just move. Now again, ego may not let you do that, but that would have avoided this whole situation if either one of them would have just moved. And now we are hearing testimony from someone who I've already said could be considered a reasonable person when we talk about fear. And this reasonable person thinks a reasonable decision would have been just to move. They could have moved. Nothing was stopping them from moving. She even said, "Let's just move." And whether or not Curtis Reeves heard her, he decided not to move, obviously. To me, that is damning testimony. Let me know if you disagree. Let me know if that's just something I'm being too nitpicky in. But as a potential juror, would that make you think that you would have just moved and that he made the decision not to, therefore continuing the altercation when he could have ended it? Let me know in the comments.
You've known your husband for almost 50 years at that point now, over 50 years. Did your husband appear to be angry to you?
No.
Was he mumbling at all?
No.
And to me right there, that's where the bias comes in, where I would probably, and again, let me know. I really want to get inside of your heads, the potential jurors. But to me, I would believe probably some of the unbiased witnesses over his wife as to whether or not he was mumbling. Did he seem angry? I may believe the wife because she knows him. That's why he said knowing your husband for 50 years. Whether or not he was angry, I'd probably believe the wife. But whether or not he was mumbling, if some of the other unbiased witnesses said he was. However, that's where the shoddy police work comes into play, where were they just regurgitating the same thing? Were they just listening to the cops and saying what the cops were saying and repeating it? And was there kind of confirmation bias there with the other witnesses? That's why the trial is like a puzzle, right? Everything is a piece. Every witness, every argument, every piece of evidence is a piece to the puzzle.
Now tell me what you saw your husband do. He got up, you described, and then what happened?
And then he slowly felt his way down the aisle.
Okay, and as your husband leaves, do you watch him leave, or this time are you watching the screen?
I was not looking at Mr. Olsen. I was either looking to his right side. I saw the screen, but I couldn't tell you what was on the screen. I didn't want to be there.
Okay.
Once again, putting us in her shoes, how scared and uncomfortable she was after that altercation. Again, she says her husband walked slowly, more of the old age stuff affecting how he would feel and how it would be reasonable for him to feel. But really, her fear now is what we're starting to see and feel. And that, to me, is really important in support of the defense.
And so, is there a reason why you just didn't get up and move?
Well, Curtis had texted Matt, I think, where we were sitting. And I thought about getting up, but I didn't.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Do you agree or disagree with me that you were expecting your son to come in any minute and sit next to you?
Yes.
So there's the answer. That's why they didn't move. They were expecting their son to come sit with them, and they didn't want to move because then he wouldn't know where they were. Fine, reasonable in the moment, but I think other people can say, you could have just texted him again like you did the first time and say, now we're on the left side of the theater instead of the middle, or whatever it may be. But a fair explanation as to why they didn't move.
Now, when your husband left, I guess at some point, does he come back?
Yes.
Now, once your husband comes back, tell me what happened. Is there some kind of conversation between your husband and Mr. Olsen in front of him?
Yes, but something happens before that.
Tell me about it.
Curtis sits down and takes his popcorn from me.
Okay, so when Curtis Reeves comes back, your husband, he passes in front of you,
Yes.
and when he passes in front of you, does he say anything to you?
No.
Again, do you hear him grumbling in any way?
No.
And when he passes you, he takes back the popcorn, is that what you described?
Right.
Okay, and then you described that he sits down again to your left.
Yes.
Because I forgot to ask you that, your husband is seated to your left.
Yes.
Now, once your husband sits down, does something happen?
He leans forward and.
Your husband,
Yes.
okay? And do you hear anything that your husband said?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Do you agree or disagree with me that you observed both men speaking, Mr. Olsen and your husband?
Yes.
Do you know who spoke first?
I'm not sure.
And that's fair, so if you don't know who spoke first, you don't know who spoke first, right?
Right.
So do you know who spoke first?
Objection
I
has to
don't.
answer.
Sustained.
A wasted objection. She already answered it. It was one question. They objected, asked, and answered. That's just a wasted objection. Makes you look like a jerk as the prosecutor, and the answer doesn't hurt you. So those are some objections I don't understand. Like, I would object everything that matters to the case that's material. I would object. I don't care how many times it is. I don't care if sometimes I look like a jerk if it is material and important. But those are the ones that are a total waste. It's not like they have some great flow going that you have to break up. So sorry, that just popped into my head.
Now, did you hear Mr. Olsen say anything in response to your husband leaning forward?
Objection, hearsay.
It's not for the truth of the matter asserted. May we approach you?
Yes, right.
Another objection here, which we're going to just skip through the sidebar, but it's not hearsay to ask if you heard something. That's a yes or no answer. Did you hear something? Yes. Not what did they say if you want her to repeat it for the truth of the matter asserted. And that's what he's saying. It's not for the truth. There's a lot of exceptions here, so we don't have to go into that right now. But let's see a little sidebar where they argue to the judge.
Okay, did you hear Mr. Olsen say something at that
Yes.
point? What did he say?
Something to the effect of, you told on me only he said the word, do you think you are?
Now, at that point, were the previews on?
I believe that's plausible that that's what was said, but is that enough to return with a fatal shot? That's for the jury to decide.
Yes.
And was this loud enough for you to hear?
Oh, yes.
Now, at that point, was Mr. Olsen seated still, or had he turned around?
This all happened very quickly. It's hard to take it a piece at a time. He did stand up and
Well,
turn
we're going to talk
around.
about that. So, in terms of when Mr. Olsen said that, do you remember whether he was sitting or standing up?
I'm not sure.
Now, at some point, does Mr. Olsen stand up?
Oh, yes, very quickly.
And when he stands up, does he turn around?
Yes,
And when you say turn around, he's right in front of you.
yes,
Is that right?
yes.
And when he turns around, is he facing you?
He's leaning towards Curtis.
Okay. So he's right in front of you, you're saying, and leaning towards your husband.
Yes.
Your Honor, excuse me. I'm going to object to the constant summing up of the testimony. We've let it go a couple of times, but now we're into some critical testimony, so I object to the summation of the testimony by counsel.
Your Honor, we're just putting it into context. Certainly, I'm not asking the same question again.
No, he's gratuitously.
Can we approach, Your Honor?
Another objection for the constant summary of the testimony. Sidebar. Let's get through it here.
Now, once Mr. Olsen stood up, what is the next thing you observe Mr. Olsen do?
leans towards Curtis. It seemed like his whole upper body was leaning towards Curtis.
And when you observe that motion, how did it make you feel in terms of what it looked like to you?
I thought he was coming over, and it just freaked me out. I was terrified.
You thought that Mr. Olsen was coming over the seat?
I did.
So this is the key testimony. She was terrified because he was coming over the seat and she felt like he was going to come all the way over, but he was leaning over towards Curtis and she was terrified. So her husband, again, this tells what's reasonable for him to feel being in fear, but also he is protecting his wife and her reasonable fear. Because if she is in fear, reasonable fear of great bodily harm or death, he can then respond with appropriate deadly force. So that's why this is such important testimony. And unfortunately for the prosecutor, they did all these objections and sidebars right before, and everybody's now paying attention. And the first couple questions back out here are the most important ones as to what Mr. Olsen did to put both Reeves in fear, reasonable fear, according to Ms. Reeves.
And so what happened when you saw that?
I briefly saw Curtis lean back or
Okay,
lean.
let's talk about that.
Okay.
You see Mr. Olsen now leaning over the seat,
Yes.
and do you, at that point, look at your husband?
Briefly, because he moved.
And tell me what you mean. Your husband moved?
I could see that his body was moving.
I don't know why he's asking a million questions as opposed to just letting her explain it. When she said Mr. Reeves leaned back, just let her explain what happened. But he keeps stopping her and asking a million questions like it's cross. To me, it's more confusing and choppy than just letting her tell what happened. And that's what the state was objecting to, because he is then like repeating her answer in his question, which I don't think is super effective, but you guys let me know.
Moving in which direction?
Towards the left.
Okay, and you're kind of leaning back as well. Is that what you're trying to describe here?
Yes.
Okay, so you see, after your husband leans back and to his left, do you see your husband's leg at all?
I think his leg was stretched out.
His right leg?
Yes.
And do you see your husband reaching for his pistol?
I do not.
Certainly you knew that your husband probably had one, right?
He normally did, but I never even, it's not something I thought about.
Did your husband announce it to you? I'm taking my pistol or anything like that?
No.
Now, you see, once your husband leans back and stretches out his leg, do you see Mr. Olsen doing anything more to your husband?
I either closed my eyes or turned to the right.
Do you see Mr. Olsen going back over his seat then again?
No.
Do you see Mr. Olsen reaching over the seat again?
No.
Do you see Mr. Olsen grabbing the popcorn from your husband's hand?
Not personally. The only place I saw that was on the video.
Okay, so when you were in the theater, did you see that?
No.
Did you see Mr. Olsen bringing back the popcorn?
No.
Did you see Mr. Olsen then move forward with it
No.
and throw it in your husband's face?
No.
Did you see the shot?
No.
Did you hear it?
Yes.
What happened once you saw the shot? What did you do?
At some point, I moved a couple of seats away, but I couldn't do that until people got up and moved.
And what was your...
So we'll kind of stop it there because that's the end of the pertinent testimony I want to talk about here. She did a great job of putting the jury there at the scene, explaining her fear. She closed her eyes and looked to the right. She knew something bad was going to happen. She felt him leaning over the seat. She was terrified. She wanted to move. The initial altercation with the cursing, all of that shows that she is in fear. And her fear is important for herself, but also to determine whether or not Curtis Reeves' fear was reasonable, or whether him protecting his wife was reasonable. So that is the pertinent testimony, and you can see sometimes how difficult direct examination can be, how clunky it can be, especially as defense lawyers. Criminal defense lawyers do a lot more cross-examining than they do direct examining. Because most of the time the state has way more witnesses, especially if you don't have an affirmative defense like this or like an insanity defense or something like that. Now, as plaintiffs' personal injury lawyers, we do a lot of the direct examining and cross-examining, but a lot of the direct examining. So people that do both sometimes are a little more fluid, but criminal defense lawyers who just do a lot of criminal defense are almost always more comfortable in cross than they are in direct. And I'm more comfortable in cross than I am in direct, absolutely without a doubt. But you can kind of see what it's like to go through this, and you have to get the important, pertinent material testimony out. You have to get that she was afraid out. You have to get where everybody was standing out. You have to get that he was louder than the previews out. You have to get that he was leaning over the chair out. You have to get those important, essential parts of your defense out through Mrs. Reeves, which they did. Let me know, give it a grade, give just this portion of the direct examination a grade for this lawyer, for this witness, A through F, however you want to, in the comments. Let me know what you thought, and make sure you like the video on the way out and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching this episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you like this content, please share it with your friends. Make sure you subscribe to our page and like our videos. If you want some interaction, get in the comments and we'll be sure to get back to you. If you want to know any more information about our firm or this page, you can find out in the description or visit tragoslaw.com. We post multiple times throughout the week, so make sure you hit that bell so you can get the notification and not miss out on the next episode.